The house was quiet, not the comforting kind of quiet, the kind that makes every sound feel louder than it should be. Just after 6:30 in the morning, on August 10th, 2019, guards made their way down a narrow corridor inside the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York City, a place designed to hold people the world had already decided were dangerous. Behind one of those heavy doors was a man whose name had become a whisper in powerful rooms and a scream everywhere else. Jeffrey Epstein. When they looked inside the cell, the silence didn't break. It settled. His body was hanging. Within minutes, news traveled faster than truth ever could. Before anyone asked how, people asked why. Before evidence was examined, conclusions were drawn. And before the day was over, a single sentence echoed across the world. He was silenced. But this story does not begin in that cell. It doesn't even begin in New York. It begins decades earlier, with a man who learned something very important, very early in life. That power doesn't need to be loud. It only needs access. Jeffrey Edward Epstein was not born into privilege. No dynasty. No famous last name. No old monies. He grew up in Brooklyn, the son of a Parks Department groundskeeper. By all visible measures, he was ordinary. Quiet, intelligent, socially awkward. But he had one skill that would later become his most dangerous weapon. He knew how to make powerful people feel comfortable. In the early 1970s, Epstein somehow landed a job teaching at the Dalton School, one of the most elite private schools in Manhattan. No formal teaching degree, no real credentials, just confidence and connections no one could fully explain. Students remembered him as strange, brilliant but detached. He talked about money constantly, power, influence, and then just as quietly as he arrived, he was gone. No public scandal, no investigation, just a door closing behind him. From there, Epstein entered the world of finance, a world that rarely asks too many questions if you promise big returns. He worked at Bear Stearns. Again, no clear explanation of how he climbed so quickly. What mattered was this: by the time Epstein was in his 30s, he had access to wealth far beyond what his background could explain. And then something else changed. He stopped acting like a man trying to become powerful. He started acting like someone who already was. Private jets, multiple properties, an island in the Caribbean, a mansion in Manhattan where cameras were everywhere except where they mattered most. People noticed, but they didn't question it. Because Epstein didn't just collect money. He collected people. Politicians, billionaires, scientists, royalties, men whose reputations were built on trust, and women who were too young to understand what trust was supposed to feel like. The girls came from broken homes, from unstable families, from places where no one would notice if they disappeared for an afternoon or longer. They were offered money for massages. Simple at first, harmless they were told, but the rules always changed once the door closed. What happened inside those rooms wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It was controlled, systematic, rehearsed, and Epstein made sure the girls understood something without ever saying it out loud. No one would believe them. For years, whispers surfaced, then vanished. Police reports were filed, then buried. In 2005, a complaint in Palm Beach should have ended everything. Instead, it exposed something far more disturbing. Epstein didn't just escape justice. He negotiated with it. Behind closed doors, federal prosecutors signed a secret non-prosecution agreement. Epstein served just 13 months in a private wing of a county jail. He was allowed to leave 6 days a week for work. The victims were never told. Some found out years later, by reading it in the news. This wasn't a failure of the system. This was the system, working exactly as designed for someone like him. And that's what makes what happened in 2019 so unsettling. Because when Epstein was arrested again, this time by federal authorities in New York, something felt different. The charges were heavier. The attention was global. And for the first time, Epstein looked scared. He wasn't just facing prison. He was facing exposure. Hard drives were seized. Witnesses came forward. Names began circulating quietly, names that never appeared on official documents. Then suddenly he was dead. No trial, No testimony, no answers, only questions that keep multiplying the more closely you look. And as we move forward in this story, what becomes clear is this: Jeffrey Epstein was not an anomaly. He was a symptom, and the truth he carried with him into that cell may have been far more dangerous than anything he ever did in life. After the arrest, the question everyone asked out loud was simple: who helped him? But the more dangerous question stayed unspoken: who protected him for decades? Jeffrey Epstein did not operate in isolation. Men like him never do. They build ecosystems, networks where silence is rewarded and curiosity is punished. At the center of Epstein's world was a small group of people who made everything run smoothly. One name surfaced again and again: Ghislaine Maxwell. Daughter of British media tycoon Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine grew up surrounded by power, privilege, and secrets. She knew how elite circles worked. She knew how to blend in without ever being questioned. Witnesses would later describe her as the gatekeeper, the recruiter, the woman who made young girls feel safe enough to step inside Epstein's world. She spoke softly. She smiled often. She presented herself as a protector. But behind closed doors, survivors say she was something else entirely. She normalized abuse. She trained girls to please powerful men. She reminded them, again and again, how easily everything could be taken away. And she was not alone. There were pilots who flew Epstein's private jet, staff who cleaned the houses, assistants who scheduled appointments without asking questions. They saw the girls. They saw the ages. They saw the money exchanged. And still the machine kept moving. Because Epstein's real currency wasn't cash. It was leverage. Former associates have hinted that Epstein kept records. Photos, videos, names, not trophies, insurance. He positioned himself at the center of elite social circles, offering access to wealth, connections, and pleasure, while quietly documenting everything. This is where the story turns darker. Epstein wasn't just exploiting victims. He was constructing a shield made of other people's secrets. That shield followed him everywhere. When police investigated in Florida, pressure came from above. Cases stalled. Witnesses were discouraged. Evidence was minimized. Prosecutors who pushed too hard were sidelined. Others were promoted. And Epstein learned the most important lesson of his life. The law was flexible if you knew who to call. Years later, when journalists began revisiting the case, something strange happened again. Sources went silent. Documents disappeared. People who had spoken freely before suddenly refused interviews. Fear doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like distance. Then came the arrest in 2019. Epstein was taken into custody at Teterboro Airport after flying back from Paris. Inside his Manhattan mansion, agents found thousands of photos, CDs labeled with names, hard drives locked behind safes. This time, there was no quiet deal, no backroom handshake. And for the first time, Epstein couldn't control the narrative. Inside the jail, he was placed on suicide watch after being found injured in his cell. But just days later, that watch was lifted. No cellmate, no constant monitoring, cameras malfunctioning at the wrong moment. A perfect storm of failures, or something else entirely. Because Epstein knew something the public didn't yet understand. Trials don't just punish the accused. They expose the protected. And the longer he stayed alive, the more dangerous he became to people far more powerful than him. As investigators prepared for what could have been one of the most explosive trials in American history, time began to feel fragile. Deadlines mattered. Testimonies mattered. And silence became valuable again. By the time Epstein was found dead, his secrets went with him. Or at least, that's what we were told. Because not everything disappeared that morning. Some evidence survived. Some witnesses kept speaking. And in the next part of this story, we step into the aftermath, the unanswered questions, the official explanations, and the cracks that appeared the moment the world was told to move on. The official story arrived quickly. Too quickly for a case this complicated. Within hours of Epstein's death, authorities described it as an apparent suicide. No press conference. No detailed timeline. Just a few carefully chosen words meant to close the conversation before it truly began. But the problem with silence is that it amplifies everything else. Almost immediately, inconsistencies surfaced. The guards assigned to Epstein's unit had reportedly fallen asleep. They had falsified logs. They hadn't checked on him for hours. 2 cameras positioned outside his cell malfunctioned that night. Not once, both, in a facility designed to prevent exactly this outcome. The medical examiner later ruled the death a suicide by hanging. But a private pathologist, hired by Epstein's family, observed fractures in the neck bones more commonly associated with strangulation. Not definitive proof, but enough to keep doubts alive. And doubts were already everywhere, because people weren't just questioning how Epstein died. They were questioning why he was allowed to die at all. He was the most high-profile inmate in the country. He had already attempted suicide weeks earlier, or so officials said. And yet basic safeguards were quietly removed. No cellmate. Reduced supervision. Broken cameras left unfixed. It didn't look like negligence. It looked like permission. As outrage grew, responsibility scattered. The guards were arrested, then later allowed to plead to lesser charges. Senior officials distanced themselves. Everyone claimed ignorance. No one claimed accountability. Meanwhile, Epstein's victims were forced to watch the man who had stolen their childhoods escape the one thing they were promised: a trial. Some spoke publicly about the emptiness that followed. Not relief, not closure, just another ending they didn't get to choose. But even in death, Epstein's shadow refused to disappear. Court documents began unsealing. Names appeared not accused, not charged, but mentioned. Powerful figures denied involvement. Some admitted association. None faced consequences. The focus shifted quickly. From Epstein to Maxwell. Ghislaine Maxwell was arrested in 2020, hiding in a secluded New Hampshire property. No fanfare, no dramatic chase, just a woman who had believed the shield would hold forever. Her trial peeled back pieces of the operation Epstein left behind. Recruitment methods, manipulation tactics, the psychological grooming that turned victims into compliance. But even then, something was missing. The men, the clients, the people the girls were told to please. They existed in testimony, in whispers, in sealed filings, but not in courts. And that absence spoke louder than any verdict. Because if Epstein had truly acted alone, this case would have ended cleanly. One predator, one accomplice, one conviction. Instead, it left behind a hollow space filled with unanswered questions. Why were some files still sealed? Why were flight logs treated like rumors instead of evidence? Why did investigators stop following certain trails just as they grew uncomfortable? The pattern was familiar. Attention, outrage, then distraction. And slowly, the world moved on. But the story didn't end there. Because Epstein's influence reached further than anyone initially understood. Into science, into politics, into institutions that shaped public trust itself. And as we move deeper into this story, what becomes clear is that Epstein didn't just exploit people. He exploited systems. Systems that were never built to protect the powerless from the powerful. In the next part, we step outside the courtroom and into the larger web, the money, the favors, and the uncomfortable relationships that still remain untouched. To understand why this case still refuses to settle, you have to step away from the jail cell and look at where Epstein was welcomed. Not tolerated, welcomed. For years, Jeffrey Epstein moved freely through spaces most people only see on television. University campuses, luxury fundraisers, private dinners with world leaders. He donated money to scientific research. He funded labs. He positioned himself as a patron of progress. And this wasn't charity. It was camouflage. Epstein understood something deeply unsettling about modern power. If you surround yourself with intellect and influence, people stop asking where the money comes from. Renowned scientists later admitted they were uncomfortable around him, but accepted his funding anyway. They described him as odd, intrusive, fixated on control. Still, doors remained open, because Epstein never pushed his way in. He was invited. Politicians attended his gatherings. Academics praised his generosity. Socialites vouched for his character, and when accusations surfaced, they didn't defend him loudly. They distanced themselves quietly. That quiet matters, because silence at that level isn't neutrality. It's strategy. Financial records later showed that Epstein continued moving money even after his first conviction. Banks flagged transactions. Concerns were raised internally, but accounts stayed open. Compliance departments hesitated. Executives signed off. In 2023 and beyond, court filings revealed just how many warnings were ignored. Not because no one noticed, but because noticing would have been inconvenient. Epstein's Island became a symbol, a place spoken about in fragments. Staff rotated frequently. NDAs were standard. No records, no paper trail. Witnesses described rituals of control, schedules that revolved around Epstein's moods, rules that changed without explanation, and always the same message: you are replaceable. When survivors later came forward, many struggled to explain why they stayed, why they returned. Trauma doesn't look like resistance. It looks like confusion, dependency, fear wrapped in routine. Epstein understood that better than most, and so did the people who looked away. After his death, investigations widened briefly, then narrowed again. Settlements were paid, statements were issued, reputations were managed. The system absorbed the shock, but the damage lingered, because Epstein didn't invent exploitation. He optimized it. He showed how abuse could be industrialized, scaled, protected, and sanitized by respectability. And that realization made one thing clear. Even without Epstein, the structure he relied on still exists. Money still opens doors. Connections still soften consequences. And victims are still asked to prove pain that was designed to be invisible. As the public's attention faded, one final question remained unresolved. What evidence was never released? What files were sealed permanently? And what truths were considered too destabilizing to become public record? Those questions don't fade with time. They wait. And in the next part of this story, we examine what surfaced quietly after Epstein was gone, the documents, the testimonies, and the revelations that never made headlines. After Epstein's death, the story didn't explode. It thinned out. Information emerged slowly, in fragments, buried in court filings and late-night news updates. Not revelations meant to shock, but details that felt deliberately dull. Technical, easy to ignore. This is how uncomfortable truths often survive. Civil lawsuits moved forward quietly. Victims sought accountability, not just from Epstein's estate, but from the institutions that had enabled him. Banks, trusts, intermediaries. One major financial institution later admitted it had continued doing business with Epstein long after concerns were raised internally. Compliance officers flagged him. Warnings were written. Nothing changed, because Epstein wasn't just a client. He was profitable. Emails revealed employees joking about him, downplaying risks, normalizing behavior that should have triggered alarms. This wasn't ignorance. It was calculation. At the same time, sealed documents began to open, slowly, selectively. Names appeared in depositions. Not accused, not charged, but connected, familiar, influential. The public reacted the same way each time. Outrage for a day, debate for a week, then exhaustion. Because implication without consequence teaches a dangerous lesson. That proximity to wrongdoing is survivable if you're important enough. Some witnesses described being flown to meetings that had nothing to do with business. Others recalled dinners where the power dynamics were unmistakable. Young women present, older men watching. Nothing illegal happened in the open. It never had to. The threat was always implied. Epstein didn't need to trap people physically. He trapped them socially, reputationally. Once you were inside his world, leaving meant explaining why. And explanations are risky. That's why so many stayed silent. Why so many didn't remember. Why so many claimed they were just there by coincidence. Coincidence repeated over years stops being coincidence. Meanwhile, Epstein's estate continued operating. Lawyers fought over assets. Money moved through shell companies and offshore accounts. Even in death, the machinery kept running. The island was abandoned, then guarded, then forgotten. No comprehensive forensic sweep ever made public. No full inventory released. Just silence again. Survivors noticed this pattern long before anyone else did. Spike, be doubted. Wait. They were told justice takes time. But time, in this case, seemed to work in only one direction. Toward erasure. Toward plausible deniability. Toward a version of history that would eventually feel incomplete, but officially closed. Yet something resisted that closure. Because Epstein's case wasn't just about abuse. It was about access. Who gets it? Who controls it? And who is protected when it's abused? As long as those questions remain unanswered, the story cannot end. In the next part, we look at the people left behind, the survivors, the whistleblowers, and the investigators who tried to keep this case alive when everything else pushed it towards silence. For the people who survived Epstein, the hardest part was never telling the story. It was being believed only in pieces. Many of them had spoken years earlier. To police officers, to journalists, to lawyers who nodded, took notes, and then disappeared. They learned quickly that truth didn't move on merit. It moved on timing, and timing was never on their side. Some survivors described how memory itself became a battlefield. Trauma blurred dates, faces, sequences. Defense attorneys later used those gaps as weapons. If you can't remember everything perfectly, maybe none of it happened. This is how power reframes pain. A few investigators tried to push back. Local detectives who followed leads that went nowhere. Federal agents frustrated by instructions they weren't allowed to question. Files were reassigned. Jurisdictions changed. Momentum dissolved. Not because there wasn't evidence, but because evidence needs permission to matter. Whistleblowers later described pressure that was subtle but constant. Phone calls that suggested caution. Emails advising restraint. A reminder of careers and how easily they could stall. No threats, no orders, just implication. And implication was always enough. When Epstein died, many survivors described an unexpected feeling. Not relief, but theft. The chance to confront him, to hear him answer, to watch him held accountable in public. That chance vanished in a cell where no cameras worked. Some tried to rebuild their lives away from the case. Others leaned in harder, refusing to let the story be simplified into a headline. They gave interviews. They testified. They relived moments they had spent years trying to forget. And still, the narrative shifted away from them. Toward speculation. Toward conspiracy. Toward arguments about how Epstein died instead of how he lived. That shift mattered, because focusing on the mystery of his death quietly pushed the victims back into the shadows. Once again, the center of the story became a man who was already gone. And that was convenient. For the institutions, for the powerful, for anyone who needed time to smooth rough edges and close uncomfortable files. Some survivors noticed something else after 2019. A fatigue in the public conversation. People wanted resolution. A clean ending. A single explanation that could be accepted and then set aside. But this case was never built for closure. Every time a document was unsealed, it raised more questions than it answered. Why were certain names redacted while others weren't? Why were some testimonies summarized instead of released in full? Legal experts pointed out that sealing is not about truth. It's about risk. Risk to reputations. Risk to institutions. Risk to public trust. And Epstein's case was full of risk. Flight logs showed patterns that were never fully explored. Phone records hinted at relationships that were never officially investigated. Financial trails stopped just short of revealing who benefited the most. It wasn't that evidence didn't exist. It was that evidence requires will. And will was in short supply. Even Ghislaine Maxwell's conviction, while significant, felt incomplete to many observers. She was found guilty of helping recruit and groom underage girls. But the people those girls were prepared for remained unnamed in court. The operation was acknowledged. The demand was not. That omission lingered. because trafficking, by definition, does not function without buyers. Yet the buyers were treated like rumors, like speculation, like something too abstract to prosecute. Over time, Epstein's name became shorthand, a symbol, a meme, and symbols are easier to dismiss than systems. But behind every joke, every reference, every uneasy laugh, the underlying truth remained. This happened in plain sight. It happened in mansions with staff, on planes with pilots, at events with guest lists. It happened because enough people decided it wasn't their responsibility to stop it. And that decision was repeated again and again and again. As years passed, official interest cooled. Cases were closed. Settlements were finalized. Statements expressed regret without consequence. History began its quiet rewrite. Epstein became an exception, an outlier, a single villain who slipped through the cracks. But the cracks were never accidental. They were designed. And that brings us to the final part of this story. Not the ending people wanted, but the ending that exists. A world where Epstein is dead, Maxwell is imprisoned, and the system that allowed everything else remains intact. In the last moments, there is no revelation, no confession, no final document that explains everything. Only absence, an empty witness stand, sealed files, and a silence that feels intentional. If stories like this continue to surface, it's not because the past refuses to stay buried. It's because it was never fully exposed in the first place. And that is where this chapter closes. If you found this story worth listening to, if you want more real cases told calmly, honestly, and without distraction, then take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and explore the other stories waiting here. Some of them are quieter than this one. Some are darker. All of them are reals. Even after everything was supposed to be over, the case kept breathing in small, uncomfortable ways. Not loudly, not enough to force headlines, just enough to remind anyone paying attention that nothing had really been resolved. New civil filings appeared years later, referencing the same familiar patterns. Same locations, same methods, different names, most of them still shielded. Journalists who revisited old leads found something unsettling. Sources who had once spoken freely were harder to reach. Some had changed careers. Some had moved. Some simply said they no longer remembered. Memory in cases like this often fades where consequences begin. International agencies briefly discussed cooperation. Jurisdictional questions stalled progress. Evidence that crossed borders became complicated, and complicated, in legal language, often means optional. Epstein's reach outside the United States became clearer in hindsight. Properties abroad. Accounts spread across financial havens. A pattern of movement that suggested planning far beyond personal indulgence. Yet no global investigation ever truly materialized. Because to investigate fully would mean confronting uncomfortable truths about how easily wealth travels and how rarely accountability follows it. In academic circles, donations once celebrated were quietly scrubbed from websites. Buildings renamed. Acknowledgements removed. Not as an admission of guilt, but as a form of historical editing. Erase the association. Preserve the institution. Survivors noticed this too. How quickly organizations distanced themselves once exposure became inevitable. How rarely apologies were paired with structural change. Epstein's case forced many to confront an unsettling idea. That exploitation does not always hide in shadows. Sometimes it operates under chandeliers. And once that idea enters public consciousness, it becomes difficult to contain. Young women began speaking about power dynamics in places previously considered untouchable. Elite spaces, exclusive programs, mentorships that blurred into something else. Not because Epstein created these dynamics, but because his case made them visible. Still, visibility did not equal justice. As the years passed, the Epstein narrative settled into a strange place. Too disturbing to forget. Too complicated to finish. A story people referenced without revisiting. And that unresolved tension lingered. Because deep down, many understood something simple. If this could happen once, it could happen again. And that understanding quietly reshaped how people looked at power itself. In the next part, we step back and look at the long shadow this case cast, not just on the legal system, but on public trust, and on the idea that truth always comes out in the end. By the time the noise finally faded, something subtle had changed. Not in the law, not in policy, but in how people listened. The Epstein case left behind a residue of distrust that didn't attach itself to one man. It attached itself to systems that had once been assumed to correct themselves. People began noticing patterns they had ignored before. How allegations were handled differently depending on status. How language softened when money entered the room. How no evidence often meant no investigation. Public trust doesn't collapse all at once. It thins, slowly, quietly. Courtrooms still functioned. Institutions still issued statements. But belief became conditional, because Epstein had shown how easily accountability could be delayed, and how delay, over time, becomes a form of denial. There were no sweeping reforms tied directly to his case. No single law passed in response to what happened. Instead, there were internal reviews, task forces, committees that promised vigilance without offering transparency. It looked responsible. It felt insufficient. For survivors, this was familiar territory. They had never expected sweeping change, only recognition. But even recognition came fragmented, filtered through legal language that avoided responsibility. The case became something people referenced when trust broke elsewhere. Another powerful figure accused, another institution hesitating. Remember Epstein, people would say, not as a demand for justice, but as a warning. A reminder of how far things can go when silence becomes policy. And yet, the most unsettling part of this story isn't what we know. It's what remains unprovable. The conversations that were never recorded. The agreements never written down. The decisions made in rooms where accountability was never invited. Those moments don't leave evidence. They leave outcomes. And the outcome here was clear. A man with no extraordinary public role managed to embed himself at the center of global power for decades. He did it without scrutiny, without interruption, and when the truth finally surfaced, it arrived incomplete. That incompleteness is the legacy, not mystery, not conspiracy, but the understanding that some truths are managed, not revealed. As this story reaches its final moments, there is no dramatic conclusion waiting. Only a pause, a space where answers should have been. And in that space, the case of Jeffrey Epstein continues to exist, not as an open investigation, but as an open question, one that never received the ending it demanded. One last part remains, not to explain, but to close. In the end, what remains is not a revelation, but a residue, a feeling that something essential was interrupted before it could be named. Jeffrey Epstein did not leave behind a manifesto. He left behind gaps. Gaps where testimony should have been. Gaps where accountability might have landed. Gaps filled instead with legal language, sealed documents, and institutional distance. History often remembers crimes through conclusions. Arrests, trials, verdicts. This one resists that structure. Because the man at the center is gone, the accomplice is imprisoned, and the system that allowed everything else continues forward, unchanged enough to recognize itself. Epstein's case didn't end with justice. It ended with management. And that distinction matters. For survivors, closure was never a courtroom moment. It was the quiet decision to keep speaking, even when the world grew tired of listening. For institutions, the priority was survival. Reputation over reckoning. Continuity over consequence. And for the public, the story slowly became something else. A reference point. A cautionary tale. Not because everything was uncovered, but because enough was exposed to make certainty impossible again. This is how some stories conclude. Not with answers, but with awareness. Awareness that power rarely collapses under truth alone. That silence can be engineered. And that accountability, when delayed long enough, begins to feel optional. The name Jeffrey Epstein will eventually fade from headlines, but the structure he exploited will not disappear so easily. It waits in access, in money, in the spaces where oversight is considered impolite. And as long as those spaces exist, stories like this will keep resurfacing, not because people are obsessed with the past, but because the past was never fully addressed. If you stayed with this story until the end, you already understand why it matters. If you want more real crime stories told calmly, honestly, and without distraction, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and explore the other cases here. Some will help you sleep, some won't, but all of them are told the same way, without noise, without shortcuts, and without forgetting the people who were never meant to be heard. This chapter ends here.